Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where I've been teaching A&P since 2002. This is episode number 66 of the show, and I can't thank you enough for joining me. I have gotten a lot of comments on Spotify lately. In fact, hundreds in the last week, and they are overwhelmingly positive. One was a little confusing, as it was someone telling me that her mother is letting her dye her hair blue. Which is great. I'm thrilled for you, but maybe you thought you were commenting on a different show? Either way, congratulations. I'm sure it will look very cool, and thanks for listening and commenting. If you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you rate and review the show. It helps me reach more people. And tell your friends, your coworkers, classmates, instructors, and anyone you think will be interested in how the human body is structured and how it functions. So I got an email from a listener recently, and that listener is Brittany, and she's a pre-nursing student from just outside of Salt Lake City, Utah, in the United States. Brittany asked if we are still using the food pyramid for dietary guidance in the U.S., and why or why not. And that's a great question because so much of nutrition is about what and what not to eat and why. So let me take a minute or two to talk about the food pyramid and its replacement, MyPlate. The food pyramid and MyPlate are both visual tools created by the U.S. government to promote healthy eating habits and guide the public on balanced nutrition. Even though both serve the same fundamental goal, they differ significantly in design, content, and emphasis. And they were developed at different points in time in response to evolving understanding of public health needs. So the food pyramid started in 1992, and it was originally developed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It was based on earlier dietary guidelines and was inspired by a similar Swedish model that was introduced in 1974. The pyramid aimed to simplify complex nutrition science and provide a clear visual hierarchy of food groups. When I was a little kid in the 70s and in the 80s, we talked about the 4 basic food groups. That was replaced by the food pyramid. The pyramid had 6 horizontal levels stacked vertically, creating a hierarchical shape. So the base was the largest, and it got smaller as it got toward the apex of the pyramid. At the base, bread, cereal, rice, and pastas were the largest section, recommending 6 to 11 servings of those a day. That's starchy carbohydrates. Above that was vegetables and fruits. 3 to 5 servings of vegetables was recommended, 2 to 4 servings of fruits was recommended. Also carbohydrates, but now we're talking about fruits and vegetables. The next one up was dairy and meat and protein. 2 to 3 servings of each. And at the top was fats, oils, and sweets, which you should use sparingly and, treats. There was some criticism on the food pyramid. For one, way too much emphasis on grains. Critics argued it encouraged high carbohydrate consumption, potentially contributing to obesity and diabetes. Also, there was a lack of distinction between healthy and unhealthy fats, or between whole and refined grains, right? So those things are also different. There are good, healthy fats, and there are unhealthy fats. And if all you're doing is fats, and you eat all unhealthy fats, then that's not helping you. Same thing with grains. If you're doing all white rice, that's not very good grain, right? You want whole grains. So that wasn't distinguished in the food pyramid. And of course, it was oversimplified. It lacked guidance on portion sizes, meal timing, or the importance of physical activity. It did not adequately reflect more current scientific research linking diet to chronic disease. My mantra is always simplify the content of anatomy and physiology, but not to the point of being inaccurate. So you can oversimplify. Now in 2005, we started transitioning to MyPyramid. This was a transitional update. In 2005, the USDA updated the original food pyramid with a new version called MyPyramid. It included vertical colored bands for each food group and added a stick figure climbing stairs to emphasize physical activity. But it was too abstract, it was less user-friendly, and people were confused by it. So then in 2011, we got the current approach, which is MyPlate. MyPlate was introduced by the USDA, replacing MyPyramid. It developed under the guidance of First Lady Michelle Obama. as part of the Let's Move campaign to fight childhood obesity. Its goal was to offer a more intuitive, practical guide to healthy eating. It had a different design. It wasn't a pyramid. It featured a dinner plate divided into 4 colored sections representing the food groups: fruits, vegetables, grains, and protein. Beside the plate is a blue circle representing dairy, like milk or yogurt. Some of the key differences between my plate and the pyramid were that the food pyramid had a triangular view and the plate was a plate. The food pyramid, its portion emphasis was on number of servings, but in my plate it based it on how much of your plate it should take up. There was minimal activity guidance in the food pyramid, and in my plate, activity is not even shown at all. But it was emphasized in the materials that accompanied my plate. My plate encouraged whole grains and lean proteins, whereas the food pyramid did not specify between those things. It also encouraged healthy fats and limits to saturated fats, which was not specified in the food pyramid. And the My Plate is simple, intuitive, and it's meal-based visualization rather than a whole day-based visualization from the food pyramid. So some of the really good things about My Plate are that it focuses on proportions, not servings, making it easier to understand just at a quick glance. It encourages half the plate to be fruits and vegetables and promotes whole grains and low-fat dairy. It can also be adapted across cultural, dietary, and age-related contexts. But it does have limitations. It doesn't address processed foods, added sugars, or alcohol. It doesn't explicitly highlight the importance of healthy oils like olive oil. The protein section doesn't differentiate between lean and processed meats. And it lacks detailed guidance on serving sizes and activity level. So there's limitations to My Plate. Nothing's going to be the be-all, end-all, and all of the guidance you need. But right now, the My Plate one is pretty decent with these limitations that I just mentioned. So to answer the question for Brittany, the transition from the food pyramid to My Plate reflects a shift from a serving-based, abstract model to a more user-friendly, proportion-based, meal-oriented model. My Plate has actually become a more accessible tool for promoting nutrition education in schools, clinics, and public health campaigns, although it still requires complementary education to be fully effective because of those limitations. Both models underscore the importance of a balanced diet, but My Plate aligns more closely with the contemporary dietary science and behavioral understanding. Brittany, thank you so much for asking that question. I love it when listeners send me emails and ask me questions to answer on the podcast, and this one, super relevant in the nutrition and metabolism episodes. So thank you so much, Brittany. I really hope that answers your question. Good luck in your pre-nursing program. So this episode begins our discussion of metabolism. There may be some overlap from my episodes on nutrition, but that's okay. Repetition is important to learning. The more you hear something, the more likely you'll be to remember it. So metabolism it is. Let's get started. We'll kick it off by discussing what metabolism actually is. Every day we ingest food and liquids that are made of our macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, plus nucleic acids. We break those substrates down into their smaller components like simple sugars, peptides, and amino acids, and fatty acids and glycerol. Then we use those components for energy and to build the structures we need like collagen fibers, contractile proteins, lipid-soluble hormones, etc. Metabolism is basically the sum of all cellular activity. It's divided into 2 phases: the breakdown phase, which we call catabolism, and the build phase, which we call anabolism. And it's not just humans. All living things exhibit metabolism. We metabolize each macronutrient differently, so I'm going to discuss them individually. Since carbohydrates are how we get most of our energy, their metabolism is pretty complex because we have to examine the transfer of energy from glucose to ATP. So let's begin with carbohydrate metabolism. Most dietary carbohydrate is burned as fuel within a few hours of absorption. Although 3 monosaccharides are absorbed from digested food, glucose, galactose, and fructose, the last 2 are quickly converted to glucose, and all oxidative carbohydrate metabolism is essentially a matter of glucose catabolism. That's the breakdown of glucose. The overall reaction for this process is C6H12O6, that's glucose, plus 6 oxygen molecules, O2, yields 6 carbon dioxide molecules, CO2, and 6 water molecules, H2O. The purpose of this reaction isn't simply to generate carbon dioxide and water, but to transfer energy from glucose to ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the molecular unit of energy transfer in cells. To understand this energy transfer, recall that oxidation is a chemical reaction in which a molecule, atom, or ion loses electrons. This loss is also described as an increase in the oxidation state of the molecule, atom, or ion. Although often associated with the gain of oxygen, oxidation can occur independently of oxygen. Its counterpart is reduction, the gain of electrons. In the pathway of glucose oxidation, several points exist where other nutrients, especially fats and amino acids, can also be oxidized to generate fuel. This makes carbohydrate catabolism a central reference point from which the catabolism of all fuels and the generation of ATP can be understood. If the overall glucose oxidation reaction were carried out in a single step, it would release a sudden burst of heat, similar to burning paper, for example, which follows the same chemical equation. Such a release would be useless to cellular metabolism and would be harmful, potentially lethal, to our cells. However, the body executes this reaction through a series of steps, each catalyzed by a different enzyme. This approach allows energy to be released in manageable amounts, with as much of it as possible transferred to ATP. The remaining energy is dissipated as heat. There are 3 major pathways of glucose catabolism. 1 is glycolysis. Glycolysis splits one glucose molecule into 2 molecules of pyruvate. 2 is anaerobic fermentation, which reduces pyruvate to lactate in the absence of oxygen. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And 3, aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen and oxidizes pyruvate to carbon dioxide and water. Enzymes catalyze the removal of electrons in the form of hydrogen atoms from intermediate compounds, but do not retain them. Instead, these hydrogen atoms are transferred to compounds called coenzymes, which later donate them to other compounds in subsequent reactions. Thus, the enzymes of glucose catabolism depend on coenzymes for function. 2 coenzymes are especially important. NAD+, which stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, and FAD, which stands for flavin adenine dinucleotide. NAD+ is derived from niacin, which is vitamin B3, and FAD from riboflavin, which is vitamin B2. You may hear people informally say NAD+ and FAD, rather than individually saying the letters of these acronyms. I'm going to say the letters out to avoid confusion. But listen closely to your instructors as they may say NAD+ and FAD, and I don't want you to get confused. Okay, so hydrogen atoms are removed in pairs, 2 protons and 2 electrons, and then transferred to a coenzyme. This produces a reduced coenzyme with a higher free energy content. The reactions are FAD plus 2H yields FADH2, and NAD plus 2H yields NADH plus a hydrogen ion. FAD binds both protons and electrons to become FADH2. NAD plus, in contrast, binds the 2 electrons but only 1 proton to become NADH. The other proton remains a free hydrogen ion, or in solution, H3O+. Okay, let's look at the first catabolic process for glucose, glycolysis. Upon entering the cell, glucose is subjected to a series of conversions known as glycolysis. This pathway involves the following 5 steps: phosphorylation, priming, cleavage, oxidation, and dephosphorylation. Let's talk about those individually. The first phase, phosphorylation, is when the enzyme hexokinase transfers a phosphate group from ATP to glucose, producing glucose 6-phosphate, or G6P. This traps glucose inside the cell and maintains a concentration gradient that favors continued glucose diffusion into the cell. Phosphorylated compounds cannot pass through the plasma membrane, so that prevents glucose from leaving. In most cells, this step is irreversible due to the absence of the enzyme that reverts G6P back to glucose. Exceptions include the absorptive cells of the small intestine, proximal convoluted tubule cells of the kidney, and liver cells, or hepatocytes. Glucose 6-phosphate is a versatile intermediate that can be converted to fats, amino acids, glycogen, or be further oxidized for energy. The second step is priming. Glucose 6-phosphate is isomerized to fructose 6-phosphate, which is again phosphorylated to form fructose 1,6-diphosphate. This primes the molecule, similar to lighting a fire with a match. 2 ATP molecules are consumed, but aerobic respiration will ultimately yield far more ATP. So even though we're going to lose 2 molecules of ATP during the priming phase, we're going to make so much more ATP during aerobic respiration that will make up for it with tons to spare. Okay, the third step is cleavage. That fructose 1,6-diphosphate splits into 2 3-carbon molecules. After a slight rearrangement, both become PGAL, phosphoglyceraldehyde or glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, either one of those. The fourth step is oxidation. Each PGAL is oxidized by removing a pair of hydrogen atoms. 1 proton and 2 electrons are accepted by NAD+, forming NADH plus our H+, our hydrogen ion. A phosphate group is added to each 3-carbon intermediate from the cell's phosphate pool, not from ATP. And then finally, dephosphorylation. In the final step, phosphate groups are transferred from the intermediates to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, forming ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and converting the intermediates into pyruvate. The net products of glycolysis from 1 glucose molecule are 2 pyruvate plus 2 NADH plus 2 hydrogen ions plus 2 ATP. While 4 ATP are produced in the dephosphorylation step, 2 were consumed in the initial phosphorylation and priming steps, so that means we have a net gain of 2 ATP. Energy still remains in the form of NADH and pyruvate, though. That's when we get into anaerobic fermentation. What happens to pyruvate is going to depend on whether or not oxygen is available. In oxygen-deprived conditions, such as intense muscular activity, cells resort to anaerobic fermentation. This allows for limited ATP production when oxygen is scarce or when mitochondria are absent, like we have in red blood cells or erythrocytes. However, glycolysis alone would quickly halt if pyruvate were not metabolized. This is because NAD+ is consumed during glycolysis and must be regenerated. Anaerobic fermentation solves this by reducing pyruvate to lactate using electrons from NADH, thereby regenerating NADH+. Lactate exits the cell and travels via the bloodstream to the liver. When oxygen becomes available again, the liver oxidizes lactate back to pyruvate, which may then enter aerobic pathways. This oxygen-dependent recovery is part of the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. The liver may also convert lactate to G6P, glucose 6-phosphate, and either store it as glycogen or remove the phosphate to release free glucose into the blood. Despite its usefulness, anaerobic fermentation has drawbacks. It is inefficient since most energy remains in lactate and contributes to no useful work. And lactate is toxic in excess. Skeletal muscle tolerates this better than cardiac muscle, while the brain employs anaerobic fermentation minimally. During birth, however, most fetal organs switch to anaerobic metabolism to preserve oxygen for the brain.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
With Robinhood, not only can you trade individual stocks and ETFs, you can also seamlessly buy and sell crypto at low costs. Trade all in one place. Get started now on Robinhood. Trading crypto involves significant risk. Crypto trading is offered through an account with Robinhood Crypto LLC. Robinhood Crypto is licensed to engage in virtual currency business activity by the New York State Department of Financial Services. Crypto held through Robinhood Crypto is not FDIC insured or SIPC protected. Investing involves risk, including loss of principal. Securities trading is offered through an account with Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, a registered broker-dealer.
Okay, then we get to aerobic respiration, and that's when it gets really, really intricate. When oxygen is plentiful, pyruvate enters the mitochondria for aerobic respiration, which includes two phases, the matrix reactions and the membrane reactions. Let's talk a little bit about mitochondria, because you might remember from your classes or way back in the very early episodes of this podcast that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. They're the cells that synthesize ATP for us. They're the ones that are giving us the most ATP. That's because they're responsible for aerobic respiration. Remember that the mitochondrial membrane is a double-layer membrane. There's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. The inner layer folds into the inside of the mitochondria. Those infoldings of the inner mitochondrial membrane are called the cristae, which is the plural of crista. The space between the cristae is called the matrix. So we have some reactions that take place in the matrix. And we have some reactions that actually take place in the inner mitochondrial membrane, the cristae. So we have matrix reactions and we have membrane reactions. And the main process that we're going to see happen in these mitochondria is the citric acid cycle, which you may have heard as the Krebs cycle. It constitutes most of the matrix reactions, but several steps have to take place before the citric acid cycle. So let's talk about those. First, pyruvate undergoes decarboxylation, losing one carbon as CO2 and forming a two-carbon compound. NAD+ oxidizes this compound, forming an acetyl group. The acetyl group binds to coenzyme A, which comes from pantothenic acid, to form acetyl-CoA, which is ready to enter the citric acid cycle. Acetyl-CoA donates 2 carbons to oxaloacetic acid, which has 4 carbons, forming citric acid, which has 6 carbons. Citric acid is rearranged and retains 6 carbon atoms. Hydrogen atoms are removed and accepted by NAD+. Another carbon dioxide, CO2, is removed, leaving a 5-carbon intermediate. Then those last 2 steps repeat. Hydrogen atoms are again removed and accepted by NAD+, and another CO2 is removed, leaving a 5-carbon intermediate. That generates another carbon dioxide and yielding a 4-carbon intermediate. At this point, all 3 carbons from pyruvate have been lost as carbon dioxide, CO2. Energy is transferred to GDP to form GTP, which donates a phosphate to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to make adenosine triphosphate. FAD accepts 2 hydrogen atoms. Then water is added to the system, and 2 hydrogen atoms are transferred to NAD+, forming oxaloacetic acid, completing the citric acid cycle. So for each glucose molecule, these matrix reactions occur twice because there were 2 pyruvates. Okay, the matrix reactions can be summarized in 4 different equations. The first one is 2 pyruvate plus 6 waters yields 6 carbon dioxide. The second is 2 ADP plus 2 phosphates yields 2 ATP. The next is 8 NAD plus 8 hydrogen molecules, H2, yields 8 NADH plus 8 hydrogen ions, or protons. And then the last one is 2 FAD plus 2 hydrogen atoms plus 2 hydrogen molecules, H2, yields 2 FADH2. At this stage, the original glucose's carbon atoms have all been released as CO2. While some energy is lost as heat, a significant portion is captured in 2 ATP, 8 NADH, and 2 FADH2 molecules. The citric acid cycle is amphibolic, which means it has both catabolic and anabolic functions. It's not only breaking down glucose, it's producing intermediates for synthesizing fats, non-essential amino acids, and heme. Okay, that was the matrix reactions. Now we have the membrane reactions, which are electron transport and ATP synthesis. The membrane reactions serve two purposes. One is to further oxidize NADH and FADH2, transferring their energy to ATP. Two is regenerate NAD plus and FAD for reuse. These steps occur through the mitochondrial electron transport chain composed of flavin mononucleotide, which receives electrons from NADH, iron sulfur centers, coenzyme Q, which accepts electrons from FADH2, copper ions, and cytochromes. Hydrogen atoms are split. Protons are pumped into the intermembrane space and electrons pass through the chain. Each carrier becomes reduced when it gains electrons and oxidized as it passes them along. Oxygen serves as the final electron acceptor. 1/2 O2 plus 2 electrons plus 2 protons yields water, H2O. This reaction forms metabolic water and underscores the body's need for oxygen. If oxygen is unavailable, the chain halts, stopping ATP production and leading to cell death. Then we have the chemiosmotic mechanism. It's called chemiosmosis because it's similar to osmosis but involves chemical substances instead of water. Chemiosmosis is the process where ions, typically protons like hydrogen ions, move across a membrane down their electrochemical gradient, releasing energy that is used to synthesize ATP. The electrons moving down the transport chain liberate energy, some of which is lost as heat, but some is used to fuel 3 respiratory enzyme complexes that involve the components of the electron transport chain. Those respiratory enzyme complexes are 1 flavin mononucleotide, or FMN, and multiple iron sulfur centers, 2 cytochromes B and C1 and an iron sulfur center, and 3 2 copper centers and cytochromes A and A3. These complexes are proton pumps, removing hydrogen ions from the matrix and pumping them into the space between the inner and outer mitochondrial membranes. Coenzyme Q transports electrons from complex 1 to complex 2, while cytochrome C transports them from complex 2 to complex 3. You may have heard of coenzyme Q10 as a dietary supplement. One of the reasons people take CoQ10 is because cholesterol-reducing drugs called statins are known to reduce CoQ synthesis, resulting in muscle pain and weakness. While the level of hydrogen ions in the matrix declines, creating an electrochemical gradient across the inner mitochondrial membrane and the matrix, hydrogen ions can only cross the membrane via ATP synthase pumps. As they follow through these pumps down their electrochemical gradient, a current is generated, whose energy is harnessed by the enzyme ATP synthase and used for ATP synthesis. This process is called chemiosmosis. Protons accumulate between the inner and outer mitochondrial membranes, establishing an electrochemical gradient. This gradient is harnessed by an enzyme called ATPase synthase, a channel protein that allows hydrogen ions to flow back into the matrix, generating ATP. This mechanism is called chemiosmosis. Okay, so what is our ATP yield from glucose oxidation? Each NADH yields approximately 2.5 ATP, and each FADH2 yields about 1.5 ATP. So if we look at the math, we have a total of 10 NADH that we're going to get ATP from. 2.5 each, that's 25 ATPs. We have 2 FADH2, and we're going to get 1.5 ATP out of each of those. That's 3. So now we're at 28. Glycolysis gives us 2. Now we're at 30. And the matrix reactions give us 2. That gives us a total of 32 ATP per glucose. This is a theoretical maximum. There's variability based on the shuttle mechanism used by different tissues. And those shuttle mechanisms are malate versus glycerol phosphate, and the energy required to transport ATP out of the mitochondria. This all varies. For example, in the cells of the kidneys, liver, and cardiac muscle, NADH transfers its electrons to malate. However, in the brain and skeletal muscle cells, NADH transfers its electrons to glycerol phosphate. Less ATP is generated by the glycerol phosphate shuttle, and there's still cells for which the ATP yield is completely unknown. So different tissues are going to have different yields for ATP, but this is a good general idea of what we're getting out of a glucose molecule if oxygen is available. Now think of it this way. Since glucose contains 686 kilocalories per mole and ATP stores 7.3 kilocalories per mole, the 32 ATP store about 234 kilocalories, with the rest lost as heat. So we're only getting about a third of the energy, and then the rest is going to generate heat. Remember, energy cannot be created nor destroyed, so if we don't convert it all to ATP, then the rest of it has to go somewhere, and it's going to go as heat. And we use that heat to maintain our body temperature. Okay, so what about glycogen? ATP is not stored in our cells. So excess glucose is converted to either glycogen or fat. A typical human body has about 400 to 450 grams of glycogen. About a quarter of that is in the liver, and about 3/4 of that is in the skeletal muscles. So the production of glycogen is called glycogenesis. It is stimulated by insulin. It begins with glucose 6-phosphate, which is isomerized to glucose 1-phosphate. And then glycogen synthase, an enzyme, removes the phosphate and adds the glucose to a growing glycogen chain. That is glycogenesis, the synthesis of glycogen to store glucose. Then we have the breakdown of glycogen. So what if we need more glucose in our blood and it's not in our blood sugar from our consumption? What we have to do is break down our glycogen stores to get it, and we call that glycogenolysis. It is stimulated by the hormone glucagon and epinephrine. Both of them break glycogen down. Glycogen phosphorylase, an enzyme, adds a phosphate to a glucose residue, yielding glucose 1-phosphate, which is then isomerized to glucose 6-phosphate. In most cells, that G6P enters glycolysis. Liver cells have glucose 6-phosphate, which removes the phosphate, freeing glucose to enter the bloodstream. So we're either going to put that glucose 6-phosphate right into our ATP production process with glycolysis, or if we're the liver, we're going to remove a phosphate, freeing it up as glucose and put it right in the blood. Muscle cells can't release glucose directly into the bloodstream, but they can contribute indirectly by producing pyruvate and lactate, which are converted to glucose by the liver. Then, what if we don't have the carbohydrate available to give us our ATP? That's when we rely on gluconeogenesis, which means the creation of new glucose. Genesis is the beginning or creating. Neo means new, glucose. So gluconeogenesis, the generation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources like glycerol and amino acids. This occurs mostly in the liver, and if you're fasting for a really long time, the kidneys. So this is how we can convert fat and protein into glucose so that we can use it for ATP. If you're on a very low carbohydrate diet, you're going to need to start getting your energy from fat stores. So you'll break down the fat, you'll turn the glycerol into glucose, and you'll use it for energy. In other situations, you might be breaking down proteins into amino acids and then using the amino acids to produce new glucose through gluconeogenesis. That's not as ideal. We want proteins to be our body's structural components. We want it to be our hormones, our neurotransmitters, things like that. It's not bad to get energy from fat. Fat has twice as much energy as carbohydrates. And maybe you're trying to actually lose weight. So you want to get your energy from fat stores. That's good. You don't want it to be so bad that you're breaking down proteins. The other thing you have to worry about is the formation of ketones from those processes. And if that happens, you could end up dropping your body's pH levels. So your blood plasma pH will come down because of those acidic ketones, and you end up in a situation called ketoacidosis, which is a metabolic acidosis that can be pretty dangerous because we know acid denatures proteins. We don't want the acidity of your body's fluids to get too low because you will start breaking down your own proteins. So that's no good. This is taxing on your liver and kidneys. We don't want to rely on gluconeogenesis. You do need carbohydrates in your diet because this is the most readily available form of energy that we use.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
Okay, so that's carbohydrate metabolism, and I think that's good for an episode. In the next episode, we will get into lipid and protein metabolism, and maybe even we'll talk about different metabolic states and metabolic rate. We'll see how long we go, and then we can get in there. But we will talk more about ketone bodies and things like that when we get into the metabolism of lipids and proteins. I hope this episode has helped you understand a little bit more about carbohydrate metabolism. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for commenting. Thank you so much for rating and reviewing the podcast. I really can't tell you how much that means to me. Once again, thank you to Million Podcasts and FeedSpot for ranking us the #1 anatomy and physiology podcast on the internet. Also the #10 biology podcast on the internet. And Spotify called us the #16 education podcast on the internet. So thank you to all of those places for recognizing what we're doing here and ranking us so highly with some of these other podcasts that are doing such a good job. And I couldn't do that without you, the listener. So I really hope this is helping you get your B or better in A&P. Good luck, and I'll talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of -55 Media. Don't forget to check out my Instagram account and my YouTube channel, both called Student Help for AP. I'm posting a lot of stuff on there right now that you can watch and that will hopefully really help you understand this A&P stuff. Very special thank you out to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where you can find my tutor video-based textbook alternative Anatomy and Physiology digital suite, already being used by several colleges and universities throughout the United States.